If you've watched my last video talking about the Soul Edge complete variants, most of them were pretty bad. If you didn't, well... But what about the legendary weapons you get on Weapon Master mode? The description doesn't tell you much except, legendary weapon, wield it to discover its true power. Unlike the last tier list, most of these weapons aren't terrible, so instead of listing them as damned or crap, I'll rename the bottom tiers to dull and competent. Speaking of which, there's one weapon on the dull tier I've been dying to talk about right away. Oh boy. Prix Felger. I hate this fucking spear. This is the most annoying weapon to use. At first glance it looks like a pretty weapon, but on the inside it's ugly. 20% attack buff is small compared to the other legendaries. The main drawback is losing 5 HP over time, and you thought Cervantes and Necrit had it bad with their Soul Edge variants. Attacking restores a good portion of your health, 10 HP, so to keep yourself alive, you have to attack every second possible. Don't stop attacking or else you get sucked dry. It's even more painful when your opponent is making breathing a privilege, or even worse, auto grab. Some Mina came out on the top with her Soul Edge, but here, her legendary weapon falls flat on the bottom tier right away. Jingo's staff is next on the dull tier. This weapon doesn't have much going on, to be blunt. The only benefit this weapon has is that it's got the longest reach. That's it. Not even a soul charge buff. This long rod of doom may have the reach, but you take chip damage from guarding. Not a lot of effects besides the two. A boring legendary that has terrible defenses. Not only did he get screwed over by not having a third outfit, he gets subpar ultimate weapons here. Ivy yet again has a weapon belonging to the D tier too. I had a hard time debating if this or one other weapon on the next tier belongs here. I chose this one because it's risky. Kaleidoscope deals big chip damage, almost as much as dealing regular damage. Speaking of which, 30% attack buff. Soul charging makes more for moves on blockable. Attacking takes away 3 HP. At least you don't lose health when soul charging, but you're still vulnerable either way. Since Ivy whips around often, you're gonna see that health go from green to red fast. The chip damage you deal is tempting, but you're going to end up chipping yourself as much as the opponent. At least it's not as bad as her Soul Edge, but still too risky to use. If you want to give her a decent weapon, try Alaroon. Competent may be too generous of a title on this tier, but at least they're not too crappy. Sophitia's Orichalcum has issues but not major risks. Its only downside is a 30% defense nerf. This glass cannon deals 20% more damage and breaks horizontal attacks with verticals. This is one of the two weapons that speeds up soul charge drastically. Fast soul charge without the soul charge buff doesn't help. You'll see someone else utilize the faster soul charge better soon. Similarly, Yoshimitsu's legendary makes him a glass cannon too, 20% damage buff and defense nerf. This one relies on soul charge as it buffs both of them. At least it's got soul charge buff, but it's got that slow default speed unfortunately. This is one of the bunch that got improved in Soul Calibur 3, but here, this one is meh compared to the others. Not as godlike as his Soul Edge. Spawn's Abomination deals the largest amount of damage in this game, a whopping 90% damage buff. However, there's a price that needs to be paid. You take 9 damage when you attack, and it's shorter ranged. 1 step forward, but takes 2 steps back. This is what you call a risky weapon. I was gonna put this on D, but at least you deal more damage instead of chip damage that hurts you just as much. This weapon can take off half of your opponent's HP by either a few hits or grabbing. This is a high risk weapon, but can work out if you're careful. Or you're a throw spammer. Ironically, Xiaohu's Soul Calibur is the weakest of the 3 variants. 20% damage buff and heals a tiny amount of HP when attacking, plus 2 HP by the way. That's the problem. Minor buffs. You take counter damage and your A attacks will be stopped by your foe's B attacks. The healing is too little to make up for that lost damage. I wanted to make this work. I tried. I really did try, but in the end, it wasn't worth it. It's pretty sad when the user of Soul Calibur in the previous game is insulted by those small buffs. But with all of that, at least it's one of her best weapons to use. Don't worry, the other 2 Soul Calibur variants will get better. Last on the competent tier list is Hongguang, held by Yun Sung. Another long-ranged weapon, but this time, the blade is invisible! Until you soul charge. which drains HP. At least you got the Soul Charge buffs, am I right? This is one of the few weapons that people get confused about. One source says it hurts him while attacking, which it doesn't. Another one says it deals chip damage. Many will say that it will buff defense by 10%, yet it doesn't feel that way, and even if it did, it's too little to notice. This is why I'm more of a show don't tell type of guy, because the footage you're seeing right now speaks for itself. Between a dick measuring contest between Kilik and Yoon-sung, the latter at least has more substance. The weapon itself is the most competent on the tier, but I'd still give him that messy Soul Edge variant regardless. Middle of the bunch. Lethe is the first entry of the Between tier. Despite not having Nirvana, it can still shoot for whatever reason. Either way, it's got longer range. The 50% attack and 20 defense buff is nice. Minus 3 HP on attack, so be careful using this one too. It's a neat looking legendary and the damage is insane. It's not as strong as Abomination, but not as harsh. After using both his Soul Edge Complete and Lethe, between the two, I'd still go with the latter. At least the loss of health isn't as severe as minus 4 HP over time. The King of Iron Fist, Tekken. Heihachi's own fists are his legendary weapon. 35% attack and defense buff with the addition of reflecting a portion of damage back to the enemy. All of that while losing health over time. I know it's Heihachi Mishima of all people, but I find it odd that his gauntlets are his life support, and without them, he's slowly losing his health. I think a more appropriate debuff would be either a defense nerf or take chip damage while guarding. It's still a surprisingly decent legendary weapon, but it's not the best, so that's why it's in the middle. Necrod's Chaos is the most unique legendary weapon out of all of them. It copies the same weapon effects as your opponent except for the range. Depending on the enemy's weapon, it can either go smoothly or rough. If it's an exact mirror match, it turns back into Necrod's default weapon. Ditto for Jobbers and others' default weapons. It's the prime definition of the Between tier. Very situational weapon, but can be fun if you want to troll your foes. Maxi's legendary Nunchuck is a glass cannon. Vajra not only has a 50% damage buff, it also deals guaranteed counter damage, more than even Cassandra's Soul Edge. Soul Charge also makes more of his moves unblockable. The only and main drawback is that you can't block. At least you could still guard impact, awesome weapon on paper, but situational. Most of Maxi's weapons have risks, and this one's no different. A safer alternative would be Fuzuroi. This one can still work if you don't care too much about defending. Lastly, on the Between tier, bring out the Guillotine, Voldo! Its effects work similar to Sophitia and Yoshimitsu's legendary weapons combined. Fast soul charging speed and buffed attacks while charged. Due to its large size, it's got larger reach. One downside is that every time you hit your foe, some of the damage was reflected back at you. Just by a little bit. As long as you're not fighting Heihachi's Tekken, it's not as scary as the other weapons when it comes to risks. The problem with this weapon, yet again, it heavily relies on Soul Charge for it to be effective. This one's another hard choice between this and the next entry of the best of the B tier. Because of what I said earlier, I'd say it'll stay comfy on the last spot on this tier. Between Guillotine and Queen's Guard, this one belongs on the awesome tier. I thought I wouldn't like it as much, but it was a pleasant surprise. Raphael's legendary weapon has a 30% attack and 40% defense buff with longer range. Like the former, some of the damage is reflected back at you. Also, B attacks break your A attacks. It's not as beefy as Lethe, but it's more forgiving. As long as you're not fighting like Mirror Shield and Spawn's Malice too. After using this weapon, I can safely confirm that it's still his best weapon despite the reflected damage risk. From here on, the next weapons don't intentionally harm you. Kreese Naga is next. Yet again, it's got longer range. 40% attack buff is always nice. Soul Charge heals Taki and buffs her attack, but it comes at the cost of nerfing her defense while charged. At least there's a good reason to use Soul Charge, but at times you'll end up taking as much damage as you've healed off, or worse, even more. To make this effect safer, try charging after throwing or landing attacks that make them fall. Even without wanting to rely on Soul Charge, it's still a fantastic legendary weapon. Talam's Soul Calibur variant is just as good as her Soul Edge counterpart. Like Xiahou, you take guaranteed counter damage, but this time you heal 5 HP per attack instead of 2, plus it's got longer reach. Pretty good amount of healing. The health recovery on attack isn't always reliable as health over time, but it's still better than the opposite any day. I'd still rather use her Soul Edge variant over this. This is the second place of the Soul Calibur variants. Fun fact, in Soul Calibur 4, she uses both Soul Calibur and Edge as her legendary. Mitsurugi's legendary weapon Damascus Sword is a beast. 75% damage and 50% defense buff. That kind of beast. Of course, there's always a drawback, and it's not being able to guard. Since you already get a defense buff, it's not as bad as you think. You can still either dodge or guard impact. You can easily demolish your foes fast with this one. This is his best weapon by far. His second best weapon, Masamune, is needlessly overpowered. And that's one of his regular weapons, by the way. Last of the awesome tier that would have been on the S tier, Link's Great Fairy Sword from Majora's Mask. It heals 5 HP over time, very fast recovery, the polar opposite of that blue feathered sack of old sacks. It's got a longer reach and 25% damage buff too. Guarding makes you take chip damage. Like that matters since it'll be healed off anyway. The attack buff is minor compared to the other weapons, but still the strongest weapon out of the 3 guest legendaries. Another reason why I consider Link to be the best out of the 3. Borderline S tier, but I'd rather be fair and make it the best in A instead.
It's dangerous!
S tier for real, dog. Starting off on the highest tier, Thanatos used by Astaroth. It's got a nice 40% defense buff and best of all, 75% healing when dealing damage. Yeah, even more than Songmina and Yoshimitsu's Soul Edge. That alone makes it godlike. You can take all the abuse from your enemy, being throw spammed, making breathing a privilege, and you still heal off that damage faster than they can say, oh shit, why won't you die? Just like Yoshimitsu's Soul Edge, you can't block, so get used to guard impacting. Needless to say, this is Astaroth's best weapon. Also, another fun fact, this weapon was reused as Salsanamel's ancient weapon in Soul Calibur 3, and later became one of his regular weapons named Death Scythe. Looks like someone had to take it away from the big boy.
I cannot allow a monster like you to possess that sword.
Valkyrie is another legendary weapon worthy of being S tier. This weapon was originally from a Namco arcade game, The Legend of Valkyrie, and Cassandra's third outfit is a reference to that game too. Oh, and Sophitia used this in Soul Edge as her legendary. It heals 3 HP over time and grants 35% damage and 30% defense buff. You take pretty nasty amount of chip damage from guarding. It works similarly to Great Fairy Sword and Soul Edge growth, but better. More damage and defense works wonders with this. It doesn't heal as much when trying to heal off that chip damage, but the healing is still great either way. If this wasn't Cassandra's best weapon, it wouldn't have been here on this tier. And now for the best of the best. This one needs no introduction. Nightmare of all people has access to Soul Calibur as his legendary. Just look at this beauty. Much better looking than Siegfried's variations. This weapon is strong. Real strong. Heals 3 HP over time and a 25% defense buff. Or is it less? Does it take counter damage? B attacks break your A attacks? This is another weapon that people get confused about. All I know is that it's a godlike legendary weapon. It's so good that it's hard to find the downsides. Even if the downsides are a mystery, they are still overshadowed by the buffs. If you ever fought Nightmare using this weapon on the extra modes, watch out. He will take your soul, or purify it when he's Siegfried. He climbed from bottom to the top, dragging Songmina down to the ditch. When it comes to legendaries, this is a simple legendary weapon. Sometimes being simple is better than being complex. And boom, that was the legendary weapon tier list. We went from attacking to survive, to copying your classmates' homework, and then to having buffs that overshadow the mystery nerfs. What do you think of these weapons? Do you agree or otherwise? Are they better than the Soul Edge variants? Let me know in the comments. The legend will never die. Oh, never mind, she's dead.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more of my stuff, subscribe and hit the bell. Okay, thanks, bye.